Hello, friends. Imagine a morning in London. In the year 1858, the air is thick with smoke. Even in the park, it smells like coal. Through the fog, you can hear the slow, rhythmic clatter of hooves. A carriage stops. Out steps a woman in a dress that seems to take up half the street. Silk, taffeta, crinoline, frills, ruffles. First, one foot emerges, then the other, followed by what feels like another 100 meters of fabric. She walks like she's on stage slowly, carefully. Not because she wants to appear graceful, but because if she takes a wrong step, she might trip over her own underwear. Have you ever wondered how women in the Victorian era went to the toilet? No, seriously, not how they wrote letters, not how they chose their fans, but how they relieved themselves while wearing 10 layers of clothing in a society where even the word leg was considered too intimate to say out loud. Today, we're not going to laugh. Okay, maybe we'll smile a little, but we'll try to walk through this strange, sometimes absurd topic slowly, calmly, and respectfully. No judgment, just curiosity and historical accuracy. If you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe and tell us which country you're listening from. We welcome every one of you. NOW, let's open the wardrobe. Let's start with the underwear. Yes, it existed. And contrary to popular myths, it was actually quite sturdy. First came the long pantaloons, or drawers. These were often made of cotton or linen. In the early 19th century, they were opened between the legs with a split. This, by the way, made nighttime potty visits a bit easier, especially if you were wearing a crinoline. But as you might guess, comfort wasn't exactly the priority. On top of that came the chemise, a simple, long shirt that looked much like a nightgown, usually made of cotton, sometimes trimmed with lace. Then came the corset and the crinoline. The corset, the symbol of feminine virtue, order, and discipline. It cinched the body, compressed the rib cage, and forced perfect posture. Its weight? Anywhere from 1 to 3 kilograms, sometimes more. Of course, it wasn't the woman herself who tightened it. That job fell to a maid. To be laced into a proper wasp waist meant breathing through your mouth, slowly and shallowly. Kind of like you're doing right now, listening to my voice. Next came the crinoline, picture a frame, made of metal, sometimes of whalebone, shaped like a bell. It was worn over a petticoat and under several more layers of skirts. Yes, you heard that right. Not 1, not 2, but sometimes up to 6. Over all that came the main dress. Fabric, heavy silk, taffeta, wool. Colors, dark and practical. Why? Because white would be dirty before you even stepped out the door. And this whole magnificent construction was not for a ball. It was for an ordinary middle-class woman, for a walk, a visit, or simply sitting at home, embroidering, and heaven forbid looking anything less than presentable. The total weight of this ensemble? Anywhere from 7 to 15 kilograms. In summer, with no rain. And now you understand, sitting in this was almost impossible. At most, one might perch on the edge of a chair, leaning slightly forward. But to relieve yourself? That's where things get really interesting. Victorian fashion wasn't just a whim. It reflected ideology, class divisions, moral values, and even national pride. But behind that lace-trimmed curtain stood a deeply practical reality, spoken of only in whispers, between women, in the privacy of a dressing room. So, what exactly did women wear during the reign of Queen Victoria? And just as importantly, what were those clothes made of? Let's begin with the most intimate layer, underwear. Pantaloons, chemises, petticoats all were typically made of cotton or linen. These were affordable, breathable materials and relatively easy to wash. Although, to be honest, laundry practices at the time were infrequent, especially in the colder months. Picture it: a large copper tub, boiling water, animal fat soap, and of course, no washing machine. Even underwear wasn't changed daily often, only once a week, sometimes even less. It all depended on the family's income, and quite literally, how many spare hands they had. Now, corsets. They were true architectural feats. Multiple layers of fabric, usually cotton with padding, sometimes with silk for formal or evening corsets. But the real magic came from the reinforcements: whalebone, and later, steel strips. Whalebone was harvested from the mouths of Greenland whales. Its unique flexibility made it perfect. It could hold a shape without snapping. A woman in a corset was like a bow, tense but flexible. The construction of a corset required an exact fit, tailored down to the millimeter, often handmade, custom ordered, and it could take weeks to finish. Even then, it had to be laced gradually. They used to say a proper young lady should tighten by an inch each month. Some managed to reach waists of 40 centimeters, a measurement that today would fit a child. Now imagine layering a crinoline over that massive skirt frame. In the early 19th century, women simply wore many layers of petticoats to create volume. But that was hot, heavy, and unsurprisingly uncomfortable. So in the 1850s, a new invention became fashionable: the cage crinoline. And this is where the magic or the nightmare begins. The frame was made of flexible steel wires, connected with ribbons, forming a dome shape. From waist to floor, it could span over a meter in diameter, sometimes more. This created the illusion of a smaller waist by contrast. And it also left a bit of space under the skirt, not for comfort, but, let's say, for logistics. According to one theory, this structure allowed women to relieve themselves over a chamber pot without lifting all their layers. Or at least, not all at once, but more on that later. On top of the crinoline came 2 or 3 more skirts, often made of wool, to help hold the shape. Then came the outer fabric, and this is where the luxury began. For formal dresses, women wore silk, taffeta, velvet, less often cotton or wool. All of these fabrics were heavy, especially in winter. Imagine a dress made of taffeta, thick, glossy, slick, rustling with every step. Add to that the weight of the corset, skirts, and undergarments, and you're carrying between 8 and 15 kilograms, worn for hours each day. And now the big question: how was all of this cleaned? Rarely, very rarely. Most evening gowns weren't washed at all, just gently wiped down with a damp cloth. Expensive dresses were passed down through generations, altered and adjusted to fit. The scent left behind after a ball or formal dinner? It didn't fade, it was masked with perfume or flower water. Sometimes scented sachets sewn right into the hem. Hygiene, of course, was a concern, but the more urgent concern was modesty and decorum. A woman was not supposed to sweat, not literally, nor metaphorically. So often, she simply suffered in silence. Or, under the polite excuse of tightening her corset, she would quietly retreat to the dressing room for a moment of relief. The fabric didn't just press on the body, it restricted movement. Sitting down in such an outfit was a skill in itself, especially if you needed to sit on a toilet. Except wait, there were no toilets, not the way we know them today. But we'll get to that in the next segment. For now, just imagine, you're a young woman in London. You're wearing 12 kilograms of clothing. You're strolling down the street when suddenly you feel that familiar sensation. It's time. But there's not a single public restroom around. Going home? That's a 30-minute carriage ride. The ride jolts, the dress squeezes, your stomach aches. So, what do? Some women carried special portable chamber pots, built discreetly into the seats of their carriages. Others simply clenched their fists and prayed the next social call would end soon. That was life, wrapped in silk and lace, with a constant, lingering thought: But what if I have to go? Right now? Soon, we'll explore exactly where Victorian women could relieve themselves, and how, with remarkable ingenuity, they managed to do it. The rustle of taffeta. The steel frame lets out a faint chime with every step. The room is cool, but your back is damp, not from heat, but from tension. You're standing, just standing, because sitting is nearly impossible. Even attempting to sit is a feat. You must perch carefully on the edge of a couch, subtly adjusting the folds of your skirt, not dropping your hat, not disturbing your gloves, not letting your shoes touch the floor in the wrong place. And all of it is done with full awareness. You are being seen, judged, your silhouette, your posture, even the tilt of your neck, are part of a social language. The crinoline, that proud dome around the hips, became more than just fashion. It was a metaphor, metallic, creaking, limiting. It could be a decoration, a prison, or even a deadly weapon, depending on the circumstances. Between 1850 and 1870, crinolines reached their most extreme dimensions. The hem could span up to 2 meters in diameter. Imagine, you enter a room, but your hips arrive first, while you're still in the hallway. People step back, furniture moves, pets scatter. It was a physical statement, I am here. And at the same time, a symbolic barrier, do not come closer. For upper-class women, the crinoline became a visual metaphor for untouchability, a private fortress made of steel and silk. But every fortress has its weak points. Crinolines could catch fire. This is no exaggeration. Silk and taffeta ignited easily from candles, fireplaces, kerosene lamps. And the crinoline structure acted like a chimney, creating airflow that fed the flames. There are documented cases where women burned alive in front of guests, their dresses engulfed, and no way to remove them quickly enough. Crinolines could get stuck in narrow stairways, doorframes, crowds. They could tip when bending down, causing a woman to fall backward, like a teapot tipping over. Crinolines could undress you. The London wind, in particular, could lift the skirt like a weather vane. And then came the question, what exactly could be seen under all those layers? The answer, it depended on the year and on the moral code. Some crinolines were worn over split drawers, open between the legs. In other cases, petticoats had slits that allowed access to the interior. This wasn't about fashion. It was about practicality, making the body reachable when necessary. In other words, for urination or defecation. But practical doesn't mean comfortable, because every attempt at relief required finding a private space, not always possible. Ensuring nothing was touched, and at 2 meters wide, that was an art. Avoiding any sounds that could reveal the act, or smells, or that shameful rustle of fabric. And this leads us to a very delicate social layer. A Victorian woman had to be well-bred, delicate, clean, still, like a porcelain figurine. Her body existed, but ideally, no one should be reminded of it. That's why the crinoline's construction, with its hidden space, became a workaround. Some historians suggest that women could relieve themselves over a chamber pot without unbracing. By spreading the folds, carefully lifting the petticoats, and adjusting the pantaloons, everything happened inside the frame. A maid, if present, stood nearby. Sometimes she held up the dress. In humbler households, women managed alone, or they simply held it. The irony? With all those layers, the lower half of the body was often quite accessible, because otherwise, going to the toilet would have been impossible. Clothing dictated behavior. Literally. Still, the crinoline remained popular for decades. Why? It created the illusion of the perfect body. A narrow waist, wide hips, the era's feminine ideal. It signaled social class. The wider the skirt, the higher the status. After all, a woman in such a gown clearly didn't work. She couldn't even walk through a market without knocking over a stall. And finally, the crinoline, strange as it sounds, was an early form of personal space. a kind of dome under which a woman could hide, or hide something else. Step, another step. Now turn slowly. Not too fast, so as not to tangle in your skirts. Your back is straight, your neck elongated, your eyes lowered. You are not merely walking, you are gliding. Through fabric, through layers, through the gaze of others. But already you are tired. Not an hour has passed since you left the house, and your legs ache. The weight of the corset presses against your ribs. The silk rustles with every movement. The skin beneath your skirts begins to sweat, but you cannot breathe freely. Your chest is captive. You try to sit, but your whole body resists. And it isn't only the fabric, it's the training. You may only sit in certain ways. You may only lean with care. Bending at the waist is almost forbidden. And if you are truly honest, you no longer know what it means to relax the muscles of your stomach. The Victorian era was an age of bodily discipline. A woman's body was an object of control, correction, submission. Clothing was one of the chief instruments of that control. Each layer dictated how to move, how to stand, how even to think. For thinking about the body was improper, especially about the fact that the body was alive, vulnerable, and full of needs. A woman was not supposed to run, not supposed to laugh loudly, and certainly not supposed to reveal any signs of physicality. Even the natural urge to relieve oneself became a secret hidden behind 7 layers of fabric. The crinoline made every step unstable. Walking required slowness, almost ceremony. Now imagine, you are out on the street, in a crowd, and suddenly a call of nature, not urgent, but insistent. What in the 21st century is solved by a quick stop at a cafe was then almost impossible. Public toilets for women did not exist. Not rare, not uncommon, they did not exist at all. A woman caught in the need to excuse herself risked social disgrace. Absurd as it sounds, in the logic of that time, it made perfect sense. The female body was to be under constant control, its needs suppressed. Public urination? Defecation? Unthinkable. Immoral. So women, especially of the upper classes, learned to read the map of the city not by landmarks, but by acceptable havens. A private club, a friend's salon, a relative's house. In extreme cases, a carriage outfitted with a hidden chamber pot. Yes, real furniture, with a concealed lid and porcelain insert, but only for those who owned such a carriage. The rest? They endured. And this brings us to the most unspoken truth: dependence. Most women could not manage this logistical ordeal without help. Someone had to hold the dress, shift the crinoline, remove the gloves, loosen the corset. That someone was usually the lady's maid, the personal attendant, the shadow of her mistress. The maid knew how to lift the skirts without letting them touch the floor, how to raise the under petticoat without wrinkling the top layer. She knew how to stand silently by the door while her mistress relieved herself asking no questions. And most importantly, she knew when not to look. Without a maid, the woman was left alone struggling with fabric, confinement, the inability to bend, and an intensifying sense of helplessness. The toilet became, in effect, a test of class, of physical endurance, of social ingenuity. Some inventive ladies used special urinets, small porcelain vessels hidden under the skirt. Perching over one, corseted and crinolined, was a kind of acrobatic performance. But at least it spared the removal of clothes. Well, almost. Still, such devices were rare. Most simply, waited, endured, postponed, and only at home, in the privacy of the bedroom, could they finally allow themselves even temporary relief. The paradox was this: in a society that placed feminine modesty on a pedestal, the very idea of natural bodily needs became shameful. Women trained themselves to ignore their body's signals. They learned to suppress discomfort. They suffered silently, all of it concealed beneath the hush of lace, the whisper of skirts, and the steady tapping of heels on stone floors. Strangely enough, these restrictions, physical, hygienic, social, became part of the background of life, normalized, even a source of pride. The less dependent you were on your body, the higher your refinement. Pure Victorian virtue. We now conclude our first segment. We've examined clothing, fabric, construction, and how fashion dictated behavior. In the next segment, we'll open the door to the most private of rooms, where what was never spoken aloud actually took place. We'll discover what toilets women had in the 19th century, where they relieved themselves, how they managed while traveling, at the theater, or visiting friends, and why the toilet was not just a physical space, but a domain of shame, secrecy, and survival. Night. The silence of the house is broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. The corridors are dark, the candles extinguished. A woman, dressed in her corset and nightgown, quietly rises from her bed. She does not walk to the bathroom. There is none. Instead, she opens a small cabinet beside the headboard. Inside sits a porcelain chamber pot with a lid, white, sometimes decorated with flowers, sometimes with the lady's monogram, politely called a commode. This was how every day of a Victorian woman's life began and ended. Chamber pots were a household necessity. They were hidden in cupboards, under beds, or in special wooden boxes with sliding doors. Sometimes they were built into chairs, turning a piece of furniture into a kind of throne. The most popular were the so-called commode chairs, heavy, upholstered armchairs with a porcelain vessel inside. On the outside, respectable furniture. On the inside, the most intimate of secrets. If a lady needed to do her business during the night, she did not have to venture into the cold yard or creaking staircases. She simply sat in the chair, and it was done. But of course, nothing was ever simple. Lifting the layers of fabric, maneuvering the crinoline, trying to settle onto the narrow seat, it became a kind of private performance, often with the help of a maid. Even the furniture itself made discreet, but recognizable, sounds. A lady might blush even alone. And this is why maids were trained not to notice. Their greatest skill was silence. By day, women often used toilet rooms, small spaces containing a pot or a close stool, a wooden box with a lid, housing a porcelain bowl inside. In wealthy households, these were emptied several times a day. In poorer ones, less often. The smell was part of daily life, and few were shocked by it. Perfume, incense, or herbs were used to soften it. And it is worth noting, the word toilet at that time meant not a lavatory at all, but a dressing table, a place where a woman arranged her hair or applied powder. Only later did the word shift toward its current meaning. On the street, things were much harder. Public toilets for women did not exist until the 1880s. Men could relieve themselves at urinals, on street corners, or in taverns. Women, by contrast, were trapped. Their bodies demanded one thing, but society insisted, no, you must endure. Some ladies found clever solutions, requesting a pause at a friend's home or cutting an outing short. In emergencies, they might use chamber pots built into carriages. Wealthy families even owned travel sets, porcelain pots in leather cases, crested with the family arms. Absurd, but true. Even the toilet could be a status symbol. And yet, more often than not, women simply endured. Patience became part of the culture. A woman's dignity was measured not only by the length of her skirt or the narrowness of her waist, but by her ability to show no signs of bodily need. In the end, a simple biological necessity became a source of fear, shame, and suffering. Paradoxically, Victorian toilet culture expressed the same idea as fashion itself. A woman was not a body, but a symbol of refinement, modesty, morality. Even if, to uphold that symbol, she had to sit at night on a porcelain pot, pretending she was still in the parlor, surrounded by lace and candlelight. Imagine, evening in London, mid-19th century. The Drury Lane Theatre. The chandeliers are glowing, the curtain about to rise, the audience in eager anticipation. Women in crinolines arrange themselves in their boxes. Men in tuxedos and frock coats discuss the premiere. The air is stifling thick with perfume, tobacco, and sometimes even sweat. Picture yourself as one of the ladies. You sit on the edge of the chair, careful not to drop your fan or brush your neighbor with the fullness of your skirt. And then suddenly your body reminds you, it's time. But where? In the theater, there is no ladies' restroom. In fact, such a thing simply doesn't exist. Men can step into the courtyard or use a urinal in the corridor. Women, they have no option but to endure. Sometimes until the end of the performance. Sometimes until the carriage finally carries them home. That could mean hours of painful restraint. And given the weight of the corset and the layers of clothing, the pressure on the bladder was far greater than what a modern woman in jeans might experience. On trains, the situation was no better. The earliest railway carriages had toilets only for men. Women used chamber pots right there in the compartment. A maid or companion would hold up a screen, trying to shield them from view. Some chose simply not to drink water before the journey. Thirst was easier to bear than shame. During trips to the countryside, women sometimes relied on portable vessels, small porcelain or metal jugs that could be hidden under a skirt. Some even had romantic names, like Morning Flower, but in essence, they were nothing more than chamber pots in miniature. Imagine standing in a carriage, jolted by bumps in the road, while carefully lifting layers of skirts to use such a flower. Even today, it sounds like a risky business. And what about walks in parks, picnics, country outings? Sometimes women were forced to slip behind a tree or into bush, but of course, this was considered deeply improper. If anyone saw, rumors spread instantly. A lady's reputation could be damaged by nothing more than being caught in a moment of human necessity. Balls and receptions posed their own challenges. Imagine a grand hall, music, dancing, glasses of champagne. A woman whirls in a waltz, her corset digging in, the drinks doing their work, and suddenly the need strikes. At best, the hosts had a dressing room with discreet chamber pots. Sometimes even a private room with a commode throne. But more often, women simply endured. They endured for hours. So long that dizziness from wine and heat was blamed on the corset, when in fact, the body was simply crying out for relief. Sometimes accidents happened. There are stories of noble women fainting right in the ballroom. Everyone assumed, the corset was too tight. But in reality, the cause was simpler. She could not hold on any longer. Fainting became, in a strange way, a socially acceptable escape. To say aloud, "Excuse me, I need the toilet," was unthinkable. But to collapse in a swoon? Entirely permissible. Thus, life in society became a constant test of endurance. The ability to hold it in was not just a habit, but a cultural skill. Girls were trained from childhood. Do not complain. Do not reveal discomfort. Do not acknowledge bodily needs. Self-restraint was synonymous with propriety. The irony is striking. At the very same time in the mid-19th century London was enduring the so-called Great Stink, the sewers were overflowing. The Thames reeked so badly that Parliament could barely meet. There was filth and stench everywhere. And yet, to speak publicly of one's own bodily needs was considered even more indecent. Women were expected to embody purity, even as they silently bore the most uncomfortable truths of their own bodies. We see the paradox clearly. Men could solve the problem quickly, easily. Women turned it into a trial of will. The body submitted to morality, and morality submitted to society. And all of this played out not in some alleyway, but in the glittering halls where Strauss waltzes were played, and the air shimmered with expensive perfume. In the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, Questions of hygiene and natural bodily needs for women were directly tied to the presence of domestic servants, especially among the middle and upper classes. Women wore multiple layers of clothing: a chemise, drawers, a corset, several petticoats, a crinoline, an overskirt, and a dress. Removing or even lifting all of this alone was difficult. That is why assisting with dressing and accompanying the mistress to the toilet was part of a maid's daily duties. The lady's maid in wealthy households, there was a special position: the lady's maid. She was a personal servant who helped her mistress with dressing, clothing care, and body care. Her responsibilities included holding up skirts and the crinoline so they wouldn't touch the floor, assisting her mistress in positioning herself on a chamber pot or a commode chair, emptying and cleaning the pots after use, preserving the intimacy of the process, never speaking of what she had witnessed. Chamber pots and commode chairs. Historical sources confirm that chamber pots were used everywhere. They were made of porcelain or metal, sometimes decorated with floral patterns. In wealthy homes, chamber pots were inserted into wooden boxes or chairs with lids. Servants emptied them regularly. During travel in carriages or trains, women used portable vessels, small porcelain or metal containers. These, too, required the help of servants to lift the clothing, remove the vessel afterward, and tidy the mistress. The absence of public toilets. Even in the mid-19th century, no public toilets for women existed in England. The first appeared only in the 1880s. Until then, women in public had only two choices: endure or use chamber pots discreetly indoors. In wealthy houses, a separate room or alcove was usually reserved for this purpose. The Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, was marked by a contradiction between the pursuit of moral strictness and the basic needs of the human body. Nowhere was this more evident than in the question of women's use of toilets. Limited infrastructure, cumbersome clothing, and strict social taboos created countless inconveniences and humiliations. The absence of public toilets for women. In Britain during the first half of the 19th century, public toilets existed only for men. The first urinals appeared in London in the 1850s. Women, however, had no access to either private stalls or equivalent facilities. This exclusion was justified by the ideal of female modesty. Pointing to a woman's physiological needs was considered indecent. As a result, women in public spaces were effectively deprived of the ability to relieve themselves. Contemporary accounts mentioned that many ladies limited their food and drink intake before long walks, carriage rides, or trips to the theater. Theaters and balls theaters in London and other major cities did not provide toilets for women until the 1880s. This forced women to sit through performances lasting several hours without relief. Historians note that fainting among women at plays and balls was extremely common. In 19th century sources, these fainting spells were typically attributed to overly tight corsets. But modern researchers suggest that often the real cause was the simple inability to use the toilet. Private balls and receptions offered slightly better conditions. There might be retiring rooms or boudoirs where chamber pots or commode chairs were discreetly placed. Servants assisted the ladies with their clothing. Yet in crowded events that lasted many hours, this did not fully solve the problem. Railway travel. The expansion of the railway system in the 19th century greatly increased travel times. The earliest British railway carriages had no toilets at all. Later, water closets were installed, but these were designated exclusively for men. Women had to use chamber pots set directly in the compartments, shielded only by screens held up by maids or companions. Some reports of mid-century railway journeys describe this practice explicitly. Special travel vessels, compact porcelain or metal containers, were also used by women and children. But in the semi-public setting of a train, they were highly inconvenient. Palaces and residences, even in royal palaces, the situation was problematic. In Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle during the 19th century, Chamber pots and commodes were still in regular use. Servants emptied them throughout the day. Although some wealthy homes already had fixed water closets, first developed in the late 18th century, they were rare. Only with the great London sewer system designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette, 1859 to 1865, did piped water toilets begin to spread, but even then they remained a privilege of the rich. Embarrassment in society. Few comic stories survive, unsurprising, as the subject was taboo and rarely appeared in print. But indirect evidence exists. Newspapers and medical journals of the Victorian era frequently reported on women fainting at social events. One of the causes listed was physiological discomfort and the impossibility of leaving the hall. Medical texts of the 19th century describe the consequences of habitual restraint in women constipation, bladder ailments, evidence that the problem was widespread. Architectural plans of homes and public buildings before the 1880s almost never included toilets for women. Only after active campaigns by women's rights groups did conditions start to change. The social significance of the problem, the lack of women's toilets, was more than a domestic inconvenience. It was a social limitation. It curtailed women's freedom of movement in cities. Ladies could not remain away from home for long without risking their health. This reinforced their attachment to the home and dependence on husbands or servants. Thus, the toilet problem was not merely a matter of health or daily life. It was a gendered issue. Women faced obstacles that men did not. Clothing in the Victorian era was not merely fashion. It was a reflection of social and cultural norms. Women wore multi-layered outfits: a chemise, drawers, a corset, several petticoats, a crinoline or bustle, an overskirt, and a dress. Such an ensemble could weigh up to 10 to 15 kilograms. Corsets and crinolines, corsets with metal or whalebone inserts, shaped the female figure, but restricted breathing and movement. In the 1850s and 1860s, crinolines reached enormous proportions, up to 2 meters in diameter, causing serious difficulties in mobility and even posing fire hazards. Later, crinolines were replaced by bustles, which shifted the volume toward the back. But the issues of restricted movement and lack of comfort remained. Materials and maintenance. The choice of fabrics depended largely on wealth. Everyday clothing for the middle class was made of cotton and wool. Dresses for social outings were crafted from silk, taffeta, or velvet. Outer garments were almost never washed. They were preserved and cleaned by dry methods. Undergarments protected these expensive fabrics from sweat and dirt, but even they were changed far less frequently than by modern standards. Function versus symbolism. Functionality often gave way to symbolism. The complexity and layering of women's attire emphasized social status, economic security, conformity to moral norms. At the same time, this heavy and restrictive clothing made women dependent on servants for dressing and undressing, while also limiting their physical activity.